Duke Alexander Whitmore's attention had fixed upon a single, jarring sight amidst the meticulously ordered foyer of his ancestral home, a sight that seemed impossible, and yet grew more infuriating with every second of silence. Eliza Fairchild, a mere maid in a frayed apron, was not bowing. She stood amidst the jagged shards of a Ming vase, a relic that had survived 3 centuries, only to be shattered by Lady Beatrice's silk-slippered foot, and she was looking him directly in the eye. The defiance was so quiet it bordered on treason. "Alexander, darling," Lady Beatrice continued, adjusting her lace sleeve with predatory grace, "the girl is clearly unfit for service. I've already drafted the papers for her immediate dismissal." Alexander raised an eyebrow, his gaze still locked on the maid's resolute face. "Dismissal, Beatrice, for an accident." "It was no accident, Your Grace." Eliza's voice cut through the room, steady and clear as a bell. Beatrice's jaw tightened. A maid. Whitmore had a maid who dared to speak without leave, and she stood there amongst the wreckage like she owned the very air she breathed. She wasn't just a servant, she was a complication that came with the house, an unbreakable piece of the estate that Alexander realized with a sudden jolt of curiosity he had no idea how to command. They say secrets are the currency of the powerful. Here at Heiress Diaries with Miascript, we're just getting started. Hit that subscribe button if you have an appetite for the unthinkable. Stay close, our archives are only going to get deeper. The heavy thud of the carriage door echoed through the grand foyer of Whitmore Manor, like the closing of a vault. Alexander Whitmore, the Duke of Thorncraft, stepped into the light of a dozen crystal chandeliers, yet his expression remained as shadowed as the evening outside. He moved with a mechanical grace, shedding his traveling cloak into the waiting hands of a valet without a word. For Alexander, life was a series of calibrated movements, a succession of ledgers to be balanced, tenant disputes to be settled, and a lineage to be maintained with the cold precision of a clockmaker. He crossed the polished marble toward his study, his boots clicking with a rhythm that spoke of absolute order. This house was his sanctuary of silence, or at least it had been until the announcement of his engagement. On his mahogany desk sat a small, velvet-lined box containing the hawthorn crest, a reminder of the union that was meant to be the crowning achievement of his ducal duty. Lady Beatrice was the perfect candidate on paper, high-born, wealthy, and possessed of a social standing that would cement the Whitmore influence for another century. Yet, as Alexander poured himself a finger of amber brandy, he felt the suffocating weight of the life he had built. His impending marriage was not a union of hearts, but a merger of estates. Beatrice moved through his halls not as a partner, but as a conqueror, already rearranging the furniture of his life to suit her rigid tastes. He thought of her sharp, assessing eyes and the way her voice carried a permanent edge of command. There was no warmth in the prospect of their shared future, only a long gray corridor of obligations. As the clock on the mantel chimed the hour, Alexander sighed, the sound lost in the vastness of the room. He was a master of a great domain, yet he felt like a stranger in his own skin. He drained his glass, the burn of the alcohol the only thing reminding him he was still capable of feeling anything at all. Tomorrow, Beatrice would arrive to discuss the wedding floral arrangements, and he would nod, he would agree, and he would continue to play the part of the dutiful Duke, unaware that the quiet defiance of a maid in the foyer had already begun to crack the foundation of his perfectly ordered world. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the heavy atmosphere of Whitmore Manor shifted from the stillness of dawn to the sharp, biting chill of Lady Beatrice's presence. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her power was a quiet, suffocating thing that moved through the corridors like a draft that no fireplace could warm. For Eliza, the day began not with the usual rhythm of chores, but with the realization that she was being hunted in the very halls she had cleaned for years. Beatrice appeared in the doorways of rooms Eliza was polishing, a silent, dark-gowned specter watching every movement. She began with the small things, the psychological pinpricks designed to fray a person's nerves. Eliza would spend an hour buffing the silver until it mirrored the morning light, only for Beatrice to glide past and leave a deliberate, smudged fingerprint on a tray. "Filth," Eliza whispered, her voice like a razor through silk. "It seems your standards are as low as your birth." The campaign intensified as the hours wore on. Beatrice ordered Eliza to move heavy trunks from the attic to the guest wing, only to demand they be moved back 10 minutes later, claiming she had changed her mind. She had the cook prepare a specific tea service, then threw the contents in the sink because Eliza had brought the wrong napkins Beatrice had hidden in the back of the linen closet. Each time Eliza was summoned, she felt the weight of Beatrice's stern, judgmental gaze, searching for a crack in her resolve, a tear in her eye, or a tremor in her hands.
But Eliza remained a fortress of calm. When Beatrice purposely spilled red wine across a fresh rug and commanded Eliza to scrub it on her knees while she entertained a guest, Eliza simply knelt and worked. She didn't look up, but she didn't look down in shame either. Her posture remained upright, her chin steady. She could feel Beatrice's frustration mounting, a cold, restrained hostility that filled the room like smoke. Beatrice wanted a servant who would tremble. She was finding instead a woman who treated her cruelty as if it were merely another layer of dust to be swept away. By the time the afternoon shadows lengthened, the psychological toll was visible only in the slight paleness of Eliza's cheeks. Beatrice cornered her in the narrow servants' passage, blocking her path with the sheer authority of her elegant frame. "You think you are clever, don't you?" Beatrice hissed, her face inches from Eliza's. "But Alexander sees only a tool, and when a tool is no longer useful, it is discarded." Eliza didn't flinch. She simply waited for the woman to move, her silence a more powerful retort than any scream. The shadow in the hall had grown long, but Eliza Fairchild was still standing in the light. The stillness of the manor at midnight was a heavy, living thing, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the long case clock in the hall. Alexander found himself unable to sleep, the impending wedding arrangements feeling less like a celebration and more like a closing net. Seeking the cold comfort of logic, he retreated to the library, a vast cavern of leather-bound wisdom that usually offered him sanctuary. He expected to find the room empty and banked in shadows. Instead, he found a single lamp burning low on a side table, and Eliza Fairchild perched on a rolling ladder, a heavy volume of classical philosophy cradled in her arms. She didn't startle when he entered. She merely closed the book, her fingers lingering on the spine with a reverence that Alexander rarely saw even in his most educated peers. He stood in the doorway, his silk dressing gown a stark contrast to her simple night shift and shawl. Yet in the amber glow of the lamp, the vast chasm of their rank seemed to soften at the edges. "Stoicism, Eliza?" he asked, his voice low so as not to disturb the silence. He recognized the crest on the binding, a rare translation of Marcus Aurelius. "It teaches that we cannot control what happens to us, only how we respond to it, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady. She descended the ladder with a grace that owed nothing to dance instructors and everything to an innate sense of self. A useful lesson for someone in my position, perhaps for someone in yours as well. Alexander moved closer, the scent of old paper and beeswax swirling between them. Any other servant would have apologized for touching the books, would have scurried away in shame. Eliza simply held his gaze. "You read as if you are searching for a weapon," he observed, leaning against a mahogany shelf. "I am searching for a shield," she corrected softly. "Lady Beatrice believes that my mind is as empty as she wishes my pockets to be. She forgets that she can command my hands, but she has no key to my thoughts." For the first time in years, Alexander felt the heavy mask of the Duke slip. They spoke then, not as master and servant, but as two minds navigating the same treacherous waters of expectation and endurance.
He found himself describing the crushing weight of the Whitmore legacy, and she spoke of the quiet nobility found in service that remained untainted by bitterness. It was an intellectual dance, a moment of profound recognition between two people who were both, in their own ways, prisoners of the roles they had been born to play. When the candle finally flickered and died, leaving them in the silver wash of moonlight, the air between them had changed. The library was no longer just a room of dead authors. It was the site of a silent rebellion. "Go to bed, Eliza," his voice thick with a sudden inexplicable ache, "before the sun reminds us who we are supposed to be." She nodded once, a gesture of mutual understanding that felt more binding than any legal contract, leaving Alexander alone in the dark with the realization that his heart was no longer entirely his own. The fragile peace of the library encounter was shattered by the cold light of a Monday morning. Lady Beatrice, possessing an instinct for social shifts honed in the viperous ballrooms of London, did not need to overhear a conversation to know that the atmosphere of the manor had changed. She saw it in the way Alexander's gaze lingered a second too long on the hallway where Eliza had just passed, and in the unsettling softening of his jaw whenever the maid was mentioned. To Beatrice, intrigue was a contagion, and she moved with clinical efficiency to quarantine the source. She began by poisoning the well of the servants' hall, the one place where Eliza should have found sanctuary. Beatrice summoned Mrs. Higgins, the formidable housekeeper, and with a series of choreographed sighs and confidential whispers, suggested that Eliza was taking advantage of the Duke's charitable nature. She hinted at late-night wanderings and a lack of proper modesty, framing Eliza's quiet dignity as a calculated arrogance. "It reflects poorly on your management, Mrs. Higgins," her voice a sharp needle of ice, "when a girl of her station forgets her place so thoroughly. One must wonder what she is truly whispering in his ear." Soon the small kindnesses Eliza had once enjoyed vanished. The other maids began to fall silent when she entered the scullery. Tasks that were usually shared, the heavy scrubbing of the hearths, the lugging of coal, were left entirely to her. When Eliza walked through the corridors, she was met not with the camaraderie of her peers, but with averted eyes and the biting sting of hushed gossip. Beatrice watched from the shadows of the upper gallery, a slight victorious curve to her lips as she witnessed Eliza's isolation. The escalation moved from social exclusion to overt sabotage. Eliza found her laundry baskets overturned, the linens stained with soot just as they were ready for the Duke's chambers. Her precious few hours of rest were stripped away by urgent commands delivered through third parties, ensuring she was kept in a state of perpetual bone-deep exhaustion. Beatrice was no longer just testing Eliza's limits. She was attempting to systematically dismantle her reputation and her spirit. Alexander, insulated by the rigid protocols of his rank, sensed the growing discord but could not pinpoint its origin. He saw Eliza's increasingly pale face and the dark circles beneath her defiant eyes, yet every time he moved to intervene, Beatrice was there, draped in silk and a mask of concern, diverting his attention to wedding guest lists and ancestral obligations. The manor had become a battlefield of whispers, and as Beatrice tightened the noose of public opinion, Eliza realized that her silent rebellion was no longer a private affair. She was being cast as the villain in a play written by her enemy, and the stakes had shifted from her pride to her very survival within the only home she knew. The following morning, the atmosphere in the manor reached a fever pitch of suppressed hostility. Lady Beatrice, her frustration at Eliza's composure finally boiling over, devised a public spectacle intended to shatter the maid's quiet dignity. In the center of the grand dining hall, beneath the judgmental portraits of Whitmore ancestors, Beatrice deliberately overturned a heavy urn of soot and damp ash onto the pristine Persian rug. "The hearth was neglected, Eliza," Beatrice announced, her voice ringing out so that the footmen and scullery maids nearby had no choice but to listen. Since you find the library's philosophy so engrossing, perhaps you have forgotten the basic labor for which you are paid. Clean it. On your knees, and do not use a brush. Use your hands. I want every speck of this filth removed before the Duke returns from his ride. It was a command designed to dehumanize, to turn a woman of intellect into a creature of the dirt. The kitchen staff watched from the shadows of the service door, their breaths held in a mixture of pity and fear. Eliza looked at the black mound of ash, then at Beatrice's gloated expression. Without a word of protest, she lowered herself. The soot stained her white apron and blackened her fingernails, the grit embedding itself into her skin. Alexander entered the hall just as Eliza was meticulously gathering the last of the damp soot. He stopped mid-stride, his riding crop hitting his boot with a sharp thwack. The sight of her, kneeling, covered in grime, yet moving with a terrifying rhythmic precision, struck him like a physical blow. He looked at Beatrice, who stood over the maid like a conqueror, and then back at Eliza. He saw the way the other servants were looking at her. The mocking whispers Beatrice had planted were dying, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. In Eliza's refusal to cry or beg, the staff saw a nobility they had been told she lacked. They saw that Beatrice's cruelty required Eliza's broken spirit to succeed, and Eliza was simply refusing to provide it. Alexander stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the room. That is enough. He reached down, his gloved hand closing around Eliza's blackened wrist to pull her to her feet. Beatrice bristled, her face contorting. She was being disciplined, Alexander. She is a servant. She is a human being, Alexander corrected, his gaze never leaving Eliza's face. He saw the smudge of ash on her forehead and the fire in her eyes that even this humiliation couldn't quench. He turned to the gathered staff. Mrs. Higgins, take Eliza to wash and see that she is given a new uniform. From this moment on, her duties will be in the library exclusively. As Eliza walked away, her back as straight as a soldier's, a subtle shift occurred in the house. The scullery maid, who had previously whispered behind her back, now stepped forward to take the heavy bucket from her hands. Beatrice stood alone in the ruined rug, realizing too late that in trying to bury Eliza in ash, she had only succeeded in revealing the diamond beneath. The shift in Eliza's status within the manor was an affront Lady Beatrice could not tolerate. Seeing Eliza ensconced in the library, surrounded by the Duke's protection and the growing loyalty of the staff, only sharpened Beatrice's resolve. Humiliation had failed. Now she required a total and irreversible destruction of character. Beatrice understood that while the Duke might admire a maid's spirit, he can never harbor a thief. The hawthorn sapphire was a heavy, teardrop-shaped stone of a blue so deep it appeared almost black in the shadows. It was an heirloom of immense value, the kind of object whose disappearance would trigger a panic that even a duke could not ignore. Beatrice chose an evening when Alexander was occupied with the estate's quarterly ledgers, ensuring the house was humming with the quiet routine of the night shift. With the stealth of a predator, Beatrice slipped into the servants' wing, a place she usually avoided with a visible shudder of disgust. The air was thinner here, smelling of plain soap and the faint dampness of the stone walls. She found Eliza's small, sparse room at the end of the narrow corridor. It was a space that reflected the woman Beatrice hated, orderly, modest, and frustratingly serene. A single book sat on the nightstand, and a small framed sketch of a countryside cottage was the only decoration. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She tucked the silver necklace beneath the thin horsehair mattress, ensuring a corner of the silver chain was just barely snagged on the frame, enough to be found by a searching hand, but hidden enough to look like a guilty secret. As she retreated, she felt a surge of cold triumph. She was not just planting jewelry, she was planting the seed of Eliza's ruin. The next morning, the manor was woken not by the rising sun, but by a shrill, practiced scream of alarm. Beatrice emerged from her dressing room in a state of carefully staged disarray, her hair loose and her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. "My necklace, the hawthorn sapphire, it's gone!" The accusation rippled through the house with the speed of a forest fire. Alexander was summoned from his breakfast, his expression darkening as he met Beatrice's frantic gaze. "It was on my vanity last night. The only person who was near my chambers after the evening turndown was that girl, the one you've been so keen to protect." Alexander's jaw tightened. He looked toward the library door where Eliza stood, pale but composed, watching the chaos. He wanted to dismiss the thought instantly, but the weight of his office demanded an investigation. Beatrice saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes and pressed her advantage. "If you will not search the servants' quarters, Alexander, then I shall call the constable myself. My family's honor is at stake." The trap was set, the bait was taken, and as the Duke began the slow, heavy walk toward the servants' wing, the silence in the hall felt like a bated breath. The dining hall was an arena of suffocating opulence, the silver candelabras casting long, flickering shadows against the tapestries. Alexander sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of stone, while the local gentry watched with poorly concealed hunger for scandal. Beatrice sat to his right, her dark gown shimmering like oil on water. She has waited until the second course, until the room was filled with the influential voices of the county, to spring the final trap. The heavy oak doors swung open as the local constable entered, his presence a jarring intrusion of law into the sanctuary of the Duke's estate. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Beatrice stood slowly, her hand trembling with a practiced, fragile grace. "I apologize for this disruption," she said, her voice carrying a sharp, melodic authority that silenced the room. "But a sacred heirloom has been taken from under this roof, the Hawthorne sapphire. My family's honor demands that the shadow of suspicion be removed from this house." She turned her gaze toward the doorway, where Eliza stood flanked by two stone-faced footmen. The maid was pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, but her chin remained fixed at that same level of quiet defiance that had first unsettled Alexander's soul. "Constable," Beatrice commanded, "search the girl's quarters. She was seen near my chambers at the hour of the disappearance." The room fell into a terrifying silence. Alexander felt the weight of every eye upon him. This was the moment of absolute division. To allow the search was to concede to Beatrice's narrative and seal Eliza's ruin. To stop it was to ignite a firestorm of social disgrace that could burn down the Whitmore name. He looked at Beatrice and saw the glint of a predator who believed she had already won. Then he looked at Eliza. She did not plead with him. She did not weep. She simply stood there, an unbreakable piece of the estate, waiting to see if the man she had met in the midnight library was real or merely another ghost of the aristocracy. "Your Grace," the constable said, his voice hesitant, "with your permission?" Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm of justice fighting against the cold shackles of duty. He realized then that Beatrice wasn't just accusing a maid, she was testing his submission to a world of cruelty he no longer wished to inhabit. If he chose the safe path, he would lose the only person who had looked at him and seen the man beneath the title. "Wait," Alexander said, the single word cutting through the air like a blade. He stood, his shadow stretching long across the table. He moved toward Eliza, his cloak trailing behind him with decisive authority. He reached the constable and held up a hand, blocking his path. "This search will proceed," he announced, his voice low and dangerous, "but not because I suspect a thief. It will proceed because I intend to find the truth behind this loss, and once it is found, the person responsible will be cast out of this house forever, regardless of their rank or their ring." Beatrice's smile faltered, a flicker of genuine fear crossing her eyes for the first time. The stakes were no longer a piece of jewelry, they were the very foundation of the Whitmore legacy. The search of the servants' wing did not begin with the constable, but with Alexander himself. He led the procession through the narrow stone-walled corridors, his presence a shield between the whispers of the guests and Eliza's dignity. When they reached her room, Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with a feverish anticipation. She watched as the constable's hands neared the thin horsehair mattress, her breath hitching in a victory she had already mentally claimed. "Wait!" Alexander's voice rang out, stopping the constable mid-motion. He did not look at the bed, he looked at Beatrice. "Before we find what has been hidden, I want to clarify the timeline. Beatrice, you said the necklace was on your vanity until you retired for the evening." "Yes, Alexander," her voice said, a fragile trill, "and Eliza was the only one who entered to turn down the lamps." Alexander nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, lint-covered scrap of velvet. "Then it is a curiosity, is it not, that the clasp of the hawthorn sapphire was brought to me this afternoon by the head groundsman. He found it snagged on a rosebush beneath your dressing-room window, the window you claimed was locked all night." The color drained from Beatrice's face, leaving it a sickly, chalky white. The constable reached under the mattress and pulled out the sapphire. It shone brilliantly in the dim light of the servants' room, but the room felt suddenly cold. "Check the chain, constable," Alexander commanded. The officer peered closely at the silver links. "The clasp is intact, Your Grace. This isn't the piece that was found in the garden." Alexander stepped into the center of the small room, his gaze hardening into something terrifying. "You planted it," Alexander said, his voice a low, final tolling of a bell. "You entered this woman's room, violated her sanctuary, and attempted to use the law to commit a murder of character. I have spent my life seeking a partner of equal standing, Beatrice. I see now that I was looking at the gown and ignoring the monster within it." He turned to the constable. "There is no thief here, only a false accuser." He then looked at Eliza, who had watched the unraveling of her enemy with the same quiet, unshakable resolve she had shown since the shattered vase. "Beatrice," Alexander said, not looking back as he walked toward the door, "my carriage will be ready in an hour. It will take you to your father's estate. Our engagement is at an end. I will not have the Whitmore name tethered to a soul so impoverished." He reached out, his hand open, and for the first time, Eliza took it, her fingers steady against his. The monster had been unmasked, and in the ruins of the deceit, the Duke finally saw the path to his own freedom. The weeks that followed the scandal of the winter dinner were a quiet revolution within the stone walls of Whitmore Manor. The carriage that bore Lady Beatrice away had left behind a vacuum of silence that was quickly filled with a new, vibrant energy. Alexander did not wait for the dust of the broken engagement to settle before making his intentions clear. He did not send Eliza back to the scullery, nor did he hide her in the shadows of the library. Instead, he invited her to sit at the morning table, a gesture that sent a shockwave through the local gentry, but was met with a secret blooming joy by the household staff. Defying every social convention that had once been his cage, Alexander began the process of elevating Eliza not as a trophy, but as his equal. He sat with her over the estate ledgers, realizing that her keen mind and stoic philosophy were the very assets the Whitmore legacy needed to survive a changing world. When the neighborhood matrons came calling with their sharpened tongues and judgmental fans, Alexander met them at the door with Eliza by his side. He introduced her not as a curiosity, but as the future Duchess of Thorncraft, his voice carrying the unshakable authority of a man who had finally found something worth defending. The transformation of the manor was more than just social, it was spiritual. The oppressive atmosphere of duty and lineage that had once felt like a shroud was replaced by a sense of genuine purpose. Eliza moved through the halls no longer in a black dress and white apron, but in gowns of deep velvet that matched the quiet fire in her eyes. Yet she remained the woman of the library. She insisted on a schoolroom being built for the children of the estate workers, and she ensured that the nobility of service was rewarded with dignity and fair wages. One evening, nearly a year after the shattered Ming vase had first brought them together, Alexander and Eliza stood on the balcony overlooking the moors. The air was crisp, smelling of heather and the promise of rain. Alexander reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the small, faint scar from the day she had gathered the soot with her bare hands, a reminder of the strength that had saved them both. "They still whisper in London, you know," Alexander said, a rare, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "They say I have lost my mind to a commoner." "Let them whisper," Eliza replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "They measure worth in gold and titles. They have no idea what it feels like to be truly seen." The Duke had inherited a house of stone, but with the maid who had once defied a monster, he had finally built a home. As the lights of the manor twinkled behind them, it was clear that the cycle of cruelty had been broken. A new chapter had begun, not one written in the blood of ancestors, but in the fierce, enduring love of two souls who had found their way through the dark to find each other. Every legend has an ending, but ours is just the beginning of a legacy. Thank you for following the Heiress Diaries. If this story of the maid who stood her ground and the Duke who finally saw her stayed with you, make sure to subscribe. There are many more diaries waiting to be opened, and the next one is even more unthinkable than the last. Until then, keep watching the shadows. You never know who's waiting to step into the light.